We are sorry. New Zealand's Prime Minister has formally apologized to the country's Pacific Island community nearly 50 years after the Dawn raids. What are the Dawn raids? Well, that is the name given to a period in the 1970s that saw New Zealand authorities crack down on people who overstayed their visas, deporting them back to their countries of origin. But even though most visa overstayers at the time were from the UK, Australia, and South Africa, the Pacific Island community was singled out, and they took the brunt of the blow. These are people who hail from islands like Samoa and Tonga, and decades later, their families continue to recall just how traumatizing the experience was for them. Take a look.
Some nights it was 4 a.m. There was a banging noise at the front door and the police would come in. I remember walking down our street and some of the older kids, they'd taunt us. They'd say, "Go home, coconuts." That was the atmosphere.
We didn't get to say goodbye to my parents. My little brother Masiu and I were left at the house with the other Tongan families living there. Masiu was only 6 years old.
A young policeman, about 22 years old, came into my room. I asked him what he was doing in my bedroom. He did not answer. I was really frightened. The same policeman went into the adjoining room where my two nephews, aged 19 and 20 years old, were asleep. The policeman shone the light into their eyes, saying, "Get up and get out."
Well, joining us now is Anna Bracewell-Worrell. She's a political reporter for News Hub Nation. So first of all, there are a lot of painful testimonies, like you just saw, from people who suffered through the Dawn raids in the 70s. And for those of our viewers who are not familiar with the story, tell us what exactly happened. What was the New Zealand government's policy towards islanders?
So for a very long time, New Zealand has relied on cheap labour from the Pacific Islands to fill kind of gaps in the workforce that's been predominantly working in factories, working as seasonal workers on the likes of farms and in picking fruit and processing fruit, for example. So for a very long time, Pacific Islanders have travelled to New Zealand often on quite short-term visas, so about 3 months long. And when economic times are good, they were largely kind of ignored if they overstayed those visas. But in the 1970s, New Zealand started to hit a bit of an economic downturn. The price of wool crashed. New Zealand relies heavily on that price of wool. And, you know, politicians were looking for a scapegoat, and that scapegoat was immigrants. They were blamed for taking jobs, and police were enabled to check the identification of people that looked like immigrants in the streets. And in practice, that meant that it was largely Pacific Islanders that were targeted, as opposed to nationals from the United States, from the United Kingdom, who actually made up kind of the bulk of those overstayers. So Pacific Islanders made up sort of about a third of overstayers, but about 86% of prosecutions, whereas people from the United States and the United Kingdom are prosecuted about 5% of the time. So it was really largely the Pacific Island community that bore the brunt of this. And the actual practice of these raids were really traumatic for people. Often they were conducted, as the name Dawn Raid suggests, you know, in the middle of the night or very early in the morning. And this was, you know, police officers with dogs, shining torches in windows, you know, knocking down doors and entering properties and asking to see identification, or just taking people straight down to the station. And a lot of people were touched by this. So, for example, at the 3-hour apology ceremony on Sunday, both the Prime Minister was personally kind of implicated because her father was a police officer and he was part of those raids. He took part in them. He says now that he feels uncomfortable about that. But on the flip side, our Minister for the Pacific people himself was Dawn raided as a child. So he had witnessed the effects of that firsthand.
How do people who suffered through this abuse and their families view the apology? I mean, it has been 50 years. Why now?
Why now is exactly that, because it's been 50 years. And I think now a lot of the New Zealand population, the vast majority of the New Zealand population, sees those Dawn raids as a really shameful chapter of our history and something that it's right to apologise for. And the apology itself has been largely accepted really graciously by the Pacific Island community, but there have been calls for more. So there have been calls for some actual solid action in response and some change some amnesty in particular for people who are overstayers. We still do have people here from the Pacific Islands who came here on short-term visas and are still here, or, you know, who made it through that Dawn raid period of history and haven't been documented.
Mm-hmm.
And those people can be completely missed out by, for example, the health system. So there's a concern now with the vaccination rolling out that there may be people within the Pacific Island community who are afraid to get vaccinated because they don't want the authorities to spot them. So, you know, there could be real benefit to society as a whole if there was an amnesty for those Pacific Island overstayers.
So what is next? Are we going to see reparations of any kind when it comes to the Dawn raids?
I think we're unlikely to see monetary reparations. There were some small kind of scholarships and some money for education announced, and we are expecting some kind of immigration announcement in the coming sort of weeks to months from the government. Why that wasn't part of Sunday's ceremony, I'm not sure. Perhaps it wasn't ready. But I don't think there'll be some kind of bulk monetary reparation. It's more likely that there will be some kind of policy change when it comes to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
There have been, for a very long time, calls for a better, more reciprocal system, because at the moment, Pacific Islanders still do come here on a very, very short-term visa and kind of work for a growing or a harvesting season.